Hello, IB History Year 1 students. We're continuing our unit on the First World War, and we're moving on to learning target number 7, which really focuses on the difference between the foreign policy pursued by Otto von Bismarck when he was Chancellor of Germany and the foreign policy pursued by Kaiser Wilhelm II after Kaiser Wilhelm had decided to remove Otto von Bismarck, had dismissed him. Now you remember that the main reason for Bismarck's dismissal was that the Kaiser felt that Bismarck's policy had been holding Germany back. And as a matter of fact, there was an extent to which this was true. Bismarck had deliberately pursued a restrained foreign policy. Bismarck once, and you've probably heard me say this before, said that politics is the art of the possible. Politics is the art of the possible. And he meant that both in foreign policy or in domestic policy, but in foreign policy as well. He wanted to pursue a practical foreign policy that would not isolate Germany. It would not antagonize other countries against Germany. And so he had deliberately held back from joining the naval arms race that was going on in the world at that time. He had held back from competing with other European states to build empire. But of course, Kaiser Wilhelm felt that as a result of that, other countries did not regard Germany and therefore did not regard him with the kind of respect that Germany, and by extension he, deserved. Germany must have its place in the sun. And so, after removing Bismarck from power, Kaiser Wilhelm II took the reins of German foreign policy. And unfortunately for Germany, just about everything he did managed to antagonize other countries in Europe, Britain, France, Russia, and ultimately you'll see, and I think you probably know this part of the story you're familiar with, his foreign policy also incited aggressive foreign policy from Germany's partners, Austria-Hungary. So let's start with this. If you remember, Bismarck had been careful to ensure that Germany maintained good relations with Russia. Even when Bismarck had forced Russia to renegotiate the Treaty of San Stefano, and they had met in Berlin and had negotiated the Treaty of Berlin, which gave the Russians less of what they wanted. Bismarck had been careful to sort of pat the Russians on the back and say, hey, but we're good, right? And they established what was called the Reinsurance Treaty. But after Bismarck was removed from power, the German government failed to renew the Reinsurance Treaty. It was a treaty with a time limit, and Germany simply allowed it to lapse. Now, this probably does not signal that Kaiser Wilhelm II had any kind of deliberately hostile intentions toward Russia. He wasn't a total ignoramus. That would put Russia at odds with Germany and would give Russia and would basically push into the hands of France a willing partner in the form of Russia. So probably, the Kaiser meant nothing deliberately hostile toward Russia by failing to renew the Reinsurance Treaty. Perhaps he simply wanted to maximize his freedom of action in foreign policy, didn't want to be tied down by any of Bismarck's old arrangements. But the Russians took it as a sign of hostility. Whether he meant it or not, the Russians took it as a sign of hostility, or at least of ambivalence toward Russia. And as a result, Bismarck's very delicately crafted and maintained diplomatic equilibrium broke down. And this created uncertainty. Whether Russia knew or suspected why Germany had failed to renew the Reinsurance Treaty, who knows? It didn't matter. It created uncertainty. And in environments of uncertainty, people start looking for partners. People start looking for support. And particularly because at this time, the Russians still regarded Britain as a rival. Russia and Britain had sort of been at it with each other over the Indian subcontinent. Russia was sort of pushing southward, pushing its influence southward into Afghanistan, which made the British feel threatened about their possessions in India. And so the Russians were looking for a partner to help balance against the power of the British. And the Germans had been their partner, but now it seemed uncertain whether Germany intended to continue in that role. So the Russians were looking for a new partner. And of course, the French, who were always concerned about Germany, of course, jumped at this opportunity because by partnering with Russia, it allowed them to put Germany in a position where if war broke out, Germany would have to fight on two fronts, which is every strategist's worst nightmare. France, of course, had every reason to be hostile to Germany. Prussia, Germany as Prussia had humiliated them in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War and had taken from them Alsace-Lorraine. French were determined to have revenge and to retake Alsace-Lorraine. And so I think most French assumed that a war with Germany was inevitable in the future and even desirable in the future. And now that Russia was sort of cut loose from their alliance with Germany, the French swooped in and forged an alliance with the Russians. And, for the Germans, that meant, again, the prospect of having to fight a two-front war against France and Russia. And so at this point, the logical move, the move that Bismarck would have made, and in fact was in the process of trying to make before he was fired, would have been for Germany to pursue some sort of alliance with the British. And yet, just about every move that Wilhelm II made from this point forward almost seemed designed to antagonize the British. So take, for example, what happened in Africa, and specifically in South Africa. Remember that Otto von Bismarck had not really participated in the scramble for Africa. He did not want to risk conflict with other European states. Remember, he was the one who had called together the European states for the Berlin Conference to make sure that they didn't end up at war with each other in contest for control of Africa. But that was an area of concern then for the Kaiser because he felt like Germany, had gotten the table scraps, which to some extent was true. And so he was determined to assert Germany's role in Africa. And Africa, therefore, became an important venue for Kaiser Wilhelm's sort of saber rattling, his demonstrations of German influence. So South Africa had originally been colonized by the Dutch, that is, the Netherlands. The Dutch who settled in South Africa referred to themselves as Afrikaners, or sometimes Boers, which was the Dutch word for farmers. So Afrikaners, if you prefer that, is Afrikaners, Afrikaners, or Boers, Boers. And they had, in the first several decades of their colonization of South Africa, had conquered and had enslaved the native Africans there. That was the nation called Basuto. They conquered and enslaved the Basuto. And the reason why they required slaves was that they were, farmers, right? I mean, the word Boer means farmer. The Dutch, the Afrikaners, had established plantations in South Africa, and they required labor. And so they took the conquered Basuto as slaves. But the Cape Colony, which is the name of South Africa at the time, the Cape Colony, referring to the Cape of Good Hope, was then in turn conquered by the British. And for the first couple of decades of British rule, the British and the Afrikaners got along fine. The British largely let the Afrikaners do what they were doing. But in 1833, the British Parliament passed a law abolishing slavery. The British were the first nation in the world to legally abolish or prohibit slavery. And that abolition applied throughout the British Empire. And that meant then that the Boers, or Afrikaners, who were practicing slavery in South Africa, were forced to give up their slaves. Many of them considered this basically a condemnation to economic ruin. Slaves were the lifeblood of their economy. And so many of them simply packed up everything they had. They packed all their belongings and made what was known as the Great Trek. The Great Trek. So a trek in Dutch means a journey. The Great Trek. And they trekked to the north. They were trying to get out of the part of South Africa where British authority was strong enough to enforce British law. You know, you understand that this is like the Wild West. There's a Even though all of South Africa might have been claimed by the British, there's a point at which if you continue to move, you eventually get out of that part where the British are actually able to exercise real authority. For the Afrikaners, that meant continuing north until they had crossed the Vaal River, Vaal, the Vaal River. And so they established what they called a free state, so independent of the Cape Colony, which they called Transvaal, the state or land across the Vaal River. And again, for a time, the British simply left them alone. But soon, the Afrikaners discovered rich deposits of diamonds and gold in Transvaal. And very quickly, British laborers who perhaps were not doing well in the Cape Colony, looking for jobs, then voyaged across the Vaal themselves. And many of them were hired to take up jobs in the diamond mines and in the gold mines. So, in a kind of an interesting turnabout, the Afrikaners who were deprived of their source of labor by the British when the British abolished slavery now began hiring British laborers to help them mine the diamonds and gold which they had discovered. And by the way, they also took on black slaves again because the British, they had moved beyond that part of South Africa where British authority was really enforceable. But of course, the British now were quite interested. And I'm not talking about the British laborers, but the British government were quite interested in expanding their authority into Transvaal because of the gold and the diamonds. And in 1896, a group of British mercenaries, led by Leander Jameson, the man there on the left, this gentleman, group of British mercenaries led by Leander Jameson, raided Transvaal. And they did not do so at the orders of the British government, but they certainly hoped that they might incite the British laborers who were working for the Afrikaners into an uprising, and that uprising might cause Transvaal to switch over and become part of the British Cape Colony. Well, it didn't happen. The British laborers were not moved to rise up against their Dutch or Afrikaner employers. And as a matter of fact, the raid was repelled by forces of the Afrikaners, led by the governor of Transvaal, Stephanus Kruger, whom you see here on the right. So what was known as the Jameson Raid, led by Leander Jameson, a raid of British hoping to incite an uprising of British workers against the Afrikaners, failed. And it was successfully suppressed by the Afrikaners led by Stephanus Kruger. Now, okay, problems for the British maybe, but nothing involving Germany, right? Well, no, not until Kaiser Wilhelm decided to get himself involved. In a telegram to Kruger, Wilhelm II congratulated him, which in and of itself was innocent, but he additionally implied that Germany might have been, and in the future would be willing to provide military assistance if there was ever any further problems with the British. So he basically said, oh, if you ever have any problems in the future with the British, call on us, we'll help you out. Now, this telegram outraged Kaiser Wilhelm II's grandmother, who was Queen Victoria of Great Britain, right? It was her daughter, Victoria, who had married Kaiser Wilhelm's father, Kaiser Frederick III. They had then had Wilhelm. Queen Victoria of Britain was his grandmother, and she wrote a stinging letter of rebuke to her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And it was, indicative of how sort of, I don't know what the word is, clueless almost, the Kaiser could be, knowing or should have known that his best bet was to form an alliance with Britain, but taking deliberately provocative action in basically saying to the Afrikaners, yeah, we'll help you fight the British. Give us a call, 2 years later, full-scale war erupted in South Africa between the British and the Afrikaners or Boers. And this was known as the Boer War. And many Germans sympathized with the Boers. There's a connection between the Germans and the Dutch. Dutch is essentially it's a Germanic language. I mean, keep in mind that Germans refer to Germany as Deutschland, and their language is Deutsch, and Germans are Deutschers. So there's a closer ethnic tie between Germans and Dutch, even than between Germans and English. Although the original English were Germanic origin as well. So many Germans sympathized with the Boers, and while Kaiser Wilhelm II this time did not suggest that German troops be deployed to support the Boers, he sent telegrams of encouragement. But Boer sympathizers in Germany collected money from German citizens. They used it to buy weapons from German manufacturers, and they shipped it to the Boers to assist them in their fight against the British. The Kaiser did nothing, though it would have been in his power to do so. The Kaiser did nothing to stop this. And as the war wound down with a hard-fought British victory, some Boers fled across the border into German Southwest Africa, one of the few German colonial possessions, which is today Namibia. And there they were sheltered from British reprisals. They escaped any sort of punishment at the hands of the British because they fled to German territory. Again, something that the Kaiser could have put an end to. But again, he didn't. So Kaiser Wilhelm was not doing anything to improve relations between himself and the British at a time when an alliance between Germany and Britain would have been a partial antidote to the French-Russian alliance that had been established. Meanwhile, in 1900, a nationalist rebellion erupted in China. China had been increasingly coming under the economic and cultural influence of Europe. I'm sure that in modern world history, you studied the Opium Wars, in which the British had been attempting to import and had been very successful in importing opium into China, had gotten about 20% of the Chinese people addicted to opium. And then when the Emperor Daogong of China had attempted to forbid the import of further opium, the British went to war against China, crushed them, forced open their ports and their rivers, forced China to sign what were called unequal treaties, and had forced open the rivers of China, the ports of China, the cities of China, not only to European trade, but to European missionaries who were attempting to spread Christianity. By 1900, a nationalist rebellion against European influence was brewing, and that erupted in 1900 in the form of what was called the Boxer Rebellion, or the Boxer Uprising. It targeted European merchants, European officials, diplomats, and European missionaries, and also, by the way, American missionaries. But really, the main victims of the Boxer Uprising were Chinese Christians, Chinese who had converted to Christianity, who were regarded as sort of cultural traitors. They certainly comprised the largest number of victims of the Boxers. Now, the threat, though, to European interests and the demand to avenge then European victims incited a military response from all of the major European powers. The Empress of China, Empress Cixi, had been forced to make a choice when this uprising broke out. Would she attempt to suppress it, or would she attempt to embrace it? And she essentially chose to embrace it by doing nothing. Cixi, who perhaps did not believe that she could successfully suppress the Boxer Rebellion, and perhaps not desiring to do so, simply effectively did nothing. She accommodated the Boxer uprising. And so, since the government of China could not or would not suppress it, and Europeans were being killed, and there was a demand amongst Europeans to avenge their deaths, and European interests there were threatened, economic interests in particular, the European powers decided to suppress the Boxer uprising themselves. And it was an 8-nation army that was deployed into China to suppress the Boxer uprising. 6 of those 8 nations who contributed soldiers were European. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. They were joined by Japan and the United States. In a speech to departing German soldiers, Wilhelm essentially exhorted them to take no prisoners among the Boxers. His speech went like this: "You know that you shall be fighting against a sly, brave, well-armed, and cruel foe. When you come upon the enemy, smite him. Pardon will not be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeit. Once, 1,000 years ago, the Huns under their king Attila made a name for themselves, one still potent in legend and tradition. May you in this way make the name German remembered in China for 1,000 years, so that no Chinaman will ever again dare to even squint at a German." So extremely bellicose language from the Kaiser, befitting his apparent insecurity, perhaps, about his own capabilities as a soldier. This was typical of what psychologists, sort of amateur psychologists among historians, um, uh, sort of attribute to him. He could not be a soldier himself, so he surrounded himself with military regalia and this sort of bellicose rhetoric. Um, but it's interesting that he compared the Germans to Huns, and in fact, during the First World War, many of the Allied propagandists latched onto this comparison, and in Britain and in the United States, for certain, Allied propaganda focused on the Germans as Huns, sort of inhuman fighters, bloodthirsty. And while German propaganda postcards like this one portrayed the Allied forces sort of punishing the Boers, um, hip hip hurrah, it says here, um, the reality was much more brutal. German troops joined Japanese troops in conducting summary executions of captured Boxers. There was no sort of course, that's exactly what the Kaiser had called for, right? Most of the other nations involved had a sort of a legal method for taking prisoners, ensuring that their rights as prisoners of war were upheld, and then sort of returning them to civilian life. But the German and Japanese armies did not. They conducted brutal executions. This happens to be a Japanese soldier beheading one of the Boxers, but the soldiers who are looking on are Germans, are German soldiers. And and the other thing, Kaiser Wilhelm also made his mark and sort of antagonized the other Europeans by insisting that this multinational force be commanded by a German general. And while the others consented, there was just a continued sense that the Kaiser was, I don't know, over the top in his expectations for the rest of Europe to accommodate for Germany. And there you are, German troops, German commander. But it was more than that, even. Wilhelm II's ambitions to demonstrate Germany's status as a world power went beyond Asia and Africa. Um, by the end of the 19th century, there was a group of Turkish modernizers, Turkish nationalists, known as the Young Turks. The Young Turks were dissatisfied with the governance of the Ottoman Empire, and you can't blame them. The Ottoman Empire had been, as we've noted before, staggering for almost 200 years, had become known as the sick man of Europe, and was handicapped by incompetent and corrupt government. The Young Turks then, as modernizers, wanted to reshape the Ottoman Empire and make it strong enough to resist further defeats at the hands of European powers. Remember that in 1877, the Russians, who we've seen were not exactly modern themselves, or we've seen that their army was not particularly competent when it had to face up against a modern army, like Japan in 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, or certainly like Germany in 1914, the First World War, which I assume you learned about, we haven't seen that yet in this unit, but you learned about it, I'm sure, in modern world history. And yet the Russians, despite all their own lack of modernity and their lack of military competence, thumped the Ottoman Empire during the Russo-Turkish War in 1877. And that really signaled the rise of the Young Turks, this group of modernizers. The Young Turks were also, they were Turkish nationalists, and I say that, but of course there was no particular need for Turkish nationalism. The Ottoman Empire was a multinational empire, and it ruled over many nations, including um, Arabs and Jews and Persians and Kurds and Armenians, but it was ruled by Turks. You know, the sultans who ruled the Ottoman Empire were Turks, and so these Young Turks were nationalists in the sense of feeling like the Ottoman Empire had accommodated other nations too much, that the Ottoman Empire was too much Ottoman and not enough Turkish. So they really had two goals. One was to modernize the empire, and another one was to accommodate the other nations less and make the Ottoman Empire more Turkish. Now, at the turn of the century, the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, nope, sorry, I thought I had a picture of him. The Sultan Abdul Hamid II embraced this idea of modernization and knew, however, that if Turkey was going to modernize, if the Ottoman Empire was going to modernize rapidly, they would require a European partner, a European power that might assist them with the technology and the technical know-how. Kaiser Wilhelm, of course, jumped at the opportunity. He was always looking for opportunities to demonstrate how important and how powerful and how influential Germany was. And he was looking to expand German influence into what we would today call the Middle East. And so Germany began construction of what was called the Baghdad Railway, which would link Istanbul, which is the capital, it was the capital at that time. Ankara is the capital of modern Turkey, but was linking Istanbul to Baghdad. That's why it was called the Baghdad Railway. This act, along with other strategic partnership between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, of course, outraged the Russians. They resented anybody who was assisting their old adversary. Russia had not gained control of the Turkish Straits. They had not gained control of the Black Sea Straits as a result of their victory against the Ottoman Empire, and they were still determined to do so. And it ticked them off that Germany was making the Ottoman Empire stronger because that would make it harder for Russia. But it also alarmed the British. You know, the British saw German interests in the Ottoman Empire as a threat to their own linkages with India. And this would be particularly true if, as a result of their partnership with the Ottoman Empire, the Germans were able to establish some sort of naval base on the Persian Gulf. So perhaps a naval base in what would be today Iraq or Saudi Arabia. And this could interrupt British linkages to India and perhaps even threaten Britain's dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's interesting. In 1908, then, when the Young Turks finally overthrew the Sultan, they continued this relationship with Germany, who provided the Ottoman Empire then with modern weapons, guns, and artillery. And so the Germans, the Kaiser was doing everything he could to demonstrate how powerful and important and influential Germany could be, but seemingly every step he took had the potential to annoy or antagonize the British, which, as we said, should have been the main target for his efforts to build an alliance. But the biggest step that he took, that led to pretty much a full break with the British happened in 1897 when Kaiser Wilhelm II appointed Alfred von Tirpitz as Grand Admiral of the German Navy. He made this move because Tirpitz had a vision of expanding Germany's Imperial Navy into a force capable of projecting German power all around the world. That is to say, he wanted to build up a two-ocean navy. Now, in a way, he was along the same lines as Alfred Thayer Mahan here in the United States, who in his work Sea Power had advocated that the United States build a two-ocean navy capable of projecting American power around the world. It was President Teddy Roosevelt who had taken up that cause. Well, in Germany, the equivalent of Mahan was Tirpitz, and the Kaiser now jumped and appointed him as Grand Admiral of the German Navy. This objective, then, was completely aligned with the Kaiser's vision for what Germany should be, a world power, a Weltmacht, world power. And it was a repudiation, then, of what Bismarck's strategy had been, which was to sort of restrain Germany from developing into a major naval power for fear of antagonizing Britain. When 1900, Admiral Tirpitz drafted and the German Reichstag dutifully approved the German Naval Law of 1900, which proposed to double the size of the German Imperial Navy, which would make it, had it fully developed right that way, the second largest navy in the world, and really positioning it to potentially challenge the British Royal Navy for dominance. And this decision to challenge Britain's dominance on the seas, that was something you didn't mess with. The British could tolerate just about all of this other stuff. All of the rest of it was annoying, antagonizing, but not a deal breaker in terms of relationship building. But the British for hundreds of years had relied on their naval dominance as the chief component of their security. And now Germany was threatening that. And that really dashed any possibility that the Germans and the British would ever form an alliance. The British now came to see Germany not as a potential ally, but as a threat. And it was at this point then that the British joined with the French in their entente cordiale. After antagonizing each other in Africa for about 20 years, the British and French now could agree on one thing, and that was that Germany was a threat and that they needed to work with each other to repel and overcome that threat. And so this is when they signed the Entente Cordiale, which is this, not an alliance, but a series of agreements in which they settled all of their own colonial disputes so that if Germany continued to become more threatening, they would be working together and not against each other. So the Kaiser was determined then, he was shocked that the British and the French had made up with each other. And he was determined to sort of put stress on that new relationship between Germany, or between Britain and France, and to try to break it. He believed that it wouldn't take a lot of stress to break the relationship, the new emerging relationship between Britain and France. Remember that France was increasing its dominating position in Morocco. And that was something that in the Entente Cordiale, the British had agreed to accept, right? The French accepted the ongoing British occupation of Egypt. The British accepted France's growing occupation and dominance over Morocco. The Kaiser hoped to rupture that. So he actually made a visit to Morocco. And there, in a speech, he attempted to stir up nationalist sentiment against the French. And in doing so, he sort of hoped that if the French were showing signs of weakness, if there was resistance to French rule in Morocco, and the French now began to show signs of weakness, he hoped that the British would see that as an opportunity to weaken France's control over Morocco. And then in some way, the British would try to take advantage of that. That would then, the temptation would be too great. The temptation for the British would be too great to take advantage of the chaos that the Kaiser had created, and would side with Germany, he hoped, and that would break the Entente, that this new relationship between Britain and France would die within a year or two of its formation. And the Kaiser felt like he could provoke that premature death by stirring nationalist resistance to the French and enticing the British to jump on it. Well, it didn't work out that way. Um, the British honored their promise and sided with the French. The Kaiser hoped to break that relationship, and it didn't work. As a matter of fact, no one sided with Germany except, predictably, Austria-Hungary. And if anything, the incident strengthened the Anglo-French relationship. Um, the apparent the, clearly the Kaiser's motives in doing what he did were transparent enough that the French and the English said, "Oh, we know what this guy's doing," and that just makes us more suspicious of him. And so, if anything, it tied the English and the French together more. And this is the point at which the French now began to encourage the British to reconcile with Russia, which was France's true ally. France and Russia had a full military alliance at this point, and now France began to encourage the British to reconcile with their ally, the Russians, which was the emergence of the Triple Entente. So in 1907, Britain and Russia did the same thing that France and Britain had done 3 years earlier. Britain and Russia sort of settled their differences over the Middle East, in Afghanistan and India. And so it was sort of a British-Russian version, an Anglo-Russian version of the Entente Cordiale that the British and the French had concluded. And so it became known informally as the Triple Entente. So let's understand, just like the Entente Cordiale, the Triple Entente, this improvement of relations between Britain and Russia and Britain and France, it was not a military alliance, not at all. That only existed between the French and the Russians. Only France and Russia were committed to protect each other in the event of war. The British would never give up their position of being an island and therefore being able to pick and choose when they wanted to get involved with things. This was called by the British, I think you've heard me mention it before, splendid isolation. The British, being an island, could choose when and when not to get involved in the affairs of the continent of Europe. They would never let themselves be tied down by a permanent alliance. So while France and Russia had a true military alliance, the inclusion of Britain in this Triple Entente was simply a symbolic of good relations that had now emerged between Britain and France and between Britain and Russia, largely provoked, though, largely incited or inspired by Germany's increasing aggressive behavior, which you can relate right back to the policies of Kaiser Wilhelm II. But what it did mean was that Britain's default position would be, if things got increasingly hostile, that Britain would be more likely to support France and Russia than to align with Germany. And it was then that Kaiser Wilhelm II and other Germans began to complain of what they called encirclement, that the rivals of Germany were now trying to hold Germany down. They were trying to suppress Germany by encircling Germany. Germany was hemmed in on all sides, to the west by France, to the east by Russia, and at sea by the British. I don't know that it was completely lost on the Kaiser that all of this had happened in response to his own behaviors. Perhaps it was. And so the Kaiser attempted one more time to break the relationship, the emerging good relations between the British and the French. And you can't fully blame him, keeping in mind that for hundreds of years, the British and the French had been at each other's throats, right? You can't blame him thinking that this 4 or 5 year hiatus in Anglo-French hostility could be turned back, and that this was a blip, that this was a sort of a derivation from historical continuity, right? That all it would take was a little push, and the British and French would be at each other's throats again. So in 1911, another nationalist rebellion broke out in Morocco against French rule there. And France responded by making a significant military deployment there. Kaiser Wilhelm again sort of sensed an opportunity to try to use this to drive a wedge between the British and the French. And this time, rather than simply visiting and making a speech, he acted much more forcefully. He deployed German warships to Agadir, which was a Moroccan port. And this was meant to be a sign. Again, it was almost an invitation to the British. Hey, if you want to stick it to the French, Germany's on your side. Come on, we've already deployed our navy, right? But once again, the British did not jump at an opportunity to join Germany, to humiliate the French, and to interfere with French control over Morocco. And again, if anything, it was Germany's provocative behavior that was seen as an outrage, and that bothered the French much more than French imperialism. I mean, the British they had no problem with French imperialism, really. As long as it didn't interfere with their own. So, if anything, the Entente and the relations between the Entente countries once again grew stronger in response to Germany's aggressive, provocative, irresponsible behavior, much to the great frustration of the Kaiser. So you see, Kaiser Wilhelm's foreign policy was perhaps designed to increase respect for Germany, but while that may have been accomplished, while countries may have become concerned or alarmed or fearful of German behavior, it did not increase the likelihood um, that they would now align with Germany. It didn't increase the likelihood that they would. It made them see Germany as threatening, but not as a prospective ally. Um, Germany may have gotten their place in the sun. They certainly had everyone's attention, but it wasn't exactly the kind of attention that was constructive for Germany, given their position, their diplomatic and their military position. All right, so that is the end of this lesson, and we're getting very, very close now to the outbreak of the First World War. And of course, the First World War broke out as a result of conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, not between Germany and Britain and Russia and France. But those countries got drawn into the conflict. And again, it's probably something you're a little bit familiar with, but we'll review that in our next lesson. So until then, try to stay healthy, try to stay safe. I look forward to teaching you again. So long, IB History Year 1 students.